I thought we would start with the basics. We're gonna do Cycle Science 101. What is a cycle? Hi, how are you, Fertility Fam? Welcome to the first Sunday Cycle Science. I hope you are well. I'm well. Let's dig into it. I see the crystal raindrops. The menstrual cycle begins with the first day of bleeding, which is counted as day one, which we often in TTC land call cycle day one or CD1 when we're on Instagram. And the cycle ends just before the next menstrual period. So menstrual cycles range anywhere from about 25 to 36 days, and bleeding lasts from 3 to 7 days with an average of 5 days. Blood loss during a cycle usually ranges from 1/2 to 2.5 ounces and is usually greatest on the second day. And remember, on the second day is when the lining starts to rebuild itself. So that's when we want to have like all those good nutrients going in. Well, we want to have them always, but we want to focus on it on day 2. The menstrual cycle is regulated by hormones. There's a luteinizing hormone, or LH, follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, which are produced by the pituitary gland. They promote ovulation and stimulate the ovaries to produce estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone stimulate the uterus and breasts to prepare for possible fertilization. These hormones are released in short bursts or pulses, like every 1 to 4 hours. So, and then the menstrual cycle has 3 phases: follicular, ovulatory, and luteal phase. And I want to focus on this because next week we're going to go into charting, and it's important to understand these 3 phases before we get into charting. So follicular phase is before the release of the egg. That's when the menses is happening, when the actual bleeding is happening, is in this phase. The ovulatory is just like what it sounds. The egg is being released. That's ovulation, which we're always tracking. And then the luteal phase is after the egg is released. What's up with the follicular phase? What does that mean? This day begins on the first day of menstrual bleeding, cycle day 1. The lining of the uterus, which is the endometrium, is thick with fluids and nutrients designed to nourish an embryo. Menstruation is the periodic discharge of blood and sloughed endometrium, collectively called menses or menstrual flow or aunt flow, from the uterus to the vagina. It is caused by the rapid decline in ovarian production of progesterone and estrogen that occurs each cycle in the absence of a pregnancy. So what does that mean? If your body recognizes that you're not pregnant, it stops creating progesterone, it stops creating estrogen. Or not stops, but it greatly declines. And so in recognition of that, there's nothing to hold on to help that endometrium lining stay strong. So your body starts to let it go. It starts to break down. It takes a couple of days at the end of your cycle to break down. And then finally, when that cycle is over, menses will begin, and that starts a new cycle. The main event in this phase is the development of follicles in the ovary. So there's a lot of other stuff going on. We have our period and we're upset when we have aunt flow, especially when we're TTC. And that's kind of the focus normally for us. But really what's happening is we're building up that nice, lovely follicle that we hope to have meet a nice, lovely sperm after ovulation. So if no egg has been fertilized, estrogen and progesterone levels are low. I said that. As a result, the top layers of the endometrium are shed and menstrual bleeding occurs. Okay. About this time, the pituitary gland increases its production of follicle stimulating hormone, which is the FSH, which a lot of us who are going through assisted reproductive technology go into the RE on cycle day 2 or cycle day 3 to have that FSH level measured in conjunction with our estrogen, or estradiol is really what they're measuring, which is a form of estrogen, to see where we are before we start the cycle. So this is important. A female is born with a finite number of egg precursors, or germ cells is what they're called. I say this is important because it's precursors, because we always hear we're born with all the eggs we'll ever have. We're actually born with the precursors to those eggs. Now there's a finite number, meaning what you have when you're born, you're not going to create any new ones. But it's also important to note that they are precursors because they're asleep. They sleep until 3 months before they're going to be ovulated, which is why we focus on all of the nutrient dense food that we're eating, our supplements, health, everything else, because you are what you ate 3 months ago when it comes to your egg being released. Your egg is what you ate 3 months ago. So just wanted to underscore that. this hormone, the FSH hormone, then stimulates the growth of 3 to 30 follicles. So this happens every month. Follicles start coming awake, right? Stimulating their growth so they can start taking on their nutrients. Each follicle contains an egg. Later in the phase, as the level of this hormone decreases, only one of these follicles, called the dominant follicle, continues to grow. Now that's in a normal cycle when we're not medicated. Normally when we're medicated, we're encouraging more follicles to grow. So it'd be more than 3 to 30, and there may be more than one dominant follicle because we're encouraging multiple follicles to be released, right? Depending on what your treatment is, your fertility treatment. So the dominant follicle continues to grow. It soon begins to produce estrogen, and the other stimulated follicles begin to break down. The increasing estrogen also begins to prepare the uterus and stimulates the luteinizing hormone surge. So if you use the advanced OPKs, ovulation prediction kit, like a clear blue, it tests for the estrogen and it tests for the luteinizing hormone, the LH. So the estrogen is going to go up first, right? It's preparing the uterus, and then that estrogen increasing triggers that luteinizing hormone to be released, which is what we test for on the cheapie sticks, is just the LH, the luteinizing hormone. Once that increases, we know that ovulation is imminent. All right. So on average, the follicular phase lasts about 13 to 14 days. Of the 3 phases, this one varies the most in length, and it can be impacted by things like stress. So that could increase the time, the duration of your follicular phase, which would delay ovulation. The luteal phase, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is more likely to be consistent. So if you have a 13 or 14-day luteal phase, every cycle you can expect to have that, unless you're doing things like working with an acupuncturist or taking herbs, doing traditional Chinese medicine to lengthen that luteal phase, which is what I did after I had my miscarriage. But typically your luteal phase stays the same. Follicular phase is going to vary. Again, it's greatly impacted by stress because stress is bad for reproduction, right? Your body it becomes fight or flight syndrome. And so your body is saying, this is not a good time for this woman to be pregnant or to be releasing eggs, so it's going to delay ovulation. If you're incredibly stressed, it may just decide this is not a good time to be pregnant. Like, she's got to work on surviving and living. And good for science for figuring that out. We shouldn't be worried about life the life of someone else when we're trying to save ourselves, right? Like on the airplane, put your own air mask on first before you save anyone else. So that's kind of built into our biological rhythms, and the body knows that. Okay, so. And this phase tends to get shorter as we near menopause. Again, we'll track this. We'll talk about this in charting so that you can see what your cycle is doing and what this means. And there are different things that may impact how you approach your fertility and how you approach TTC that charting can inform. So I just want to make sure we have these basics, and then next week we'll talk about charting. So the follicular phase ends when the level of luteinizing hormone increases dramatically, which is that surge that we're looking for, right? The surge results in the release of the egg, which is ovulation, and marks the beginning of the next phase. The dominant follicle releases its oocyte at ovulation and promotes artresia of the other recruited follicles, or attrition, right? The other recruited follicles are going to go wah, 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 and they kind of just dissipate. Once that egg is released, the follicle where it was becomes a corpus luteum, and it's going to continue to release progesterone when we get into the next phase. Just to summarize that, in the follicular phase, the primary event that's happening is that we're preparing a follicle for release, hence follicular follicle phase. Circulating LH levels increase slowly beginning 1 to 2 days after the increase of FSH. The recruited ovarian follicles soon increase production of estradiol. Estradiol simulates LH and FSH synthesis, but inhibits their secretion. So it's building it up, but doesn't let it secrete. During the late follicular phase, the second half, the follicle selected for ovulation matures, accumulates hormone-secreting granulosa cells, and it reaches the follicle reaching 8 to 20 millimeters before ovulation. So that's like when we go in for our mid-cycle scan, we know that the RE is measuring our follicles, and so they decide when they will trigger or not. They typically like it to be at least 18 before they trigger. All right, let's go on to the next phase. Phase number 2, drum roll. Ovulatory phase. So this phase begins when the level of luteinizing hormone surges, which we said in the last one. Luteinizing hormone, or LH, stimulates a dominant follicle to bulge from the surface of the ovary and finally rupture. And that's when it's coming out. That's ovulation, releasing that egg. The level of follicle-stimulating hormone increases to a lesser degree. The function of the increase in follicle-stimulating hormone is not fully understood by science. The ovulatory phase usually lasts 16 to 32 hours. It ends when the egg is released, about 10 to 12 hours after the surge and the level of luteinizing hormone. So after you get that big surge, your egg is going to start being released 10 to 12 hours. The egg can be fertilized for only up to about 12 hours after its release. And then after that, it's going to get absorbed and be on its merry way. The surge in luteinizing hormone can be detected by measuring the level of this hormone in urine, which is what we all do when we do our ovulation protection kits. This measurement can be used to determine when women are fertile. Fertilization is more likely when sperm are present in the reproductive tract before the egg is released. Most pregnancies occur when intercourse occurs within 3 days before ovulation. So you got to get those swimmers in there and waiting, and they're like, where's that egg? Well, not that sounded kind of creepy, but they're excited and waiting for the egg. Around the time of ovulation, some women feel a dull pain on one side. That pain is called Mittelschmerz. It's German. It literally means middle pain. A lot of people on the boards I read talk about this. I don't know if I've ever actually felt it, or if it's like a placebo effect because I read about it. I'm like, oh, that must be it. But some people have it, and there are different theories about it. Like, I've heard different acupuncturists say if you're actually having it, it's a problem with your cycle. You shouldn't feel pain. And other people say that it's normal. It depends on your body. Once you start charting, you become much more in tune with your body, and so you'll have a better sense of if you're experiencing it or not. And I think because I haven't experienced it on a consistent basis, I'm leaning toward I don't have Mittelschmerz, but sometimes I would like to have it, so I imagine that. But anyway, the pain may precede or follow the rupture of the follicle and may not occur in all cycles. So there you go. The egg release does not alternate between two ovaries and appears to be random. If one ovary is removed, the remaining ovary releases an egg every month. And I've experienced that myself, going through RE, or going to the RE on a regular basis. Is sometimes it's right ovary, right ovary, right ovary. Sometimes it's left, left, left. When I first started, my right ovary was asleep. I mentioned that in my DHEA and CoQ10 video. And so after I started taking the DHEA and CoQ10, or ubiquinol, then that right ovary started producing follicles for me. But prior to that, I was releasing on the left side. So I think, I don't know, I had that misunderstanding, like maybe from growing up, that it's right then left, then right then left, that it always alternates, but that's not actually what happens. It's whoever grows fastest and becomes dominant first. So, all right, ovulation, ovum release occurs. Oh, the magic happens. So estradiol levels usually peak as the ovulatory phase begins. Progesterone levels also begin to increase. Stored luteinizing hormone is now released. Remember we said it was suppressing it? It's released in massive amounts, usually over 36 to 48 hours, with a smaller increase in FSH. And remember we said it's pulsing, so it's coming out like every 1 to 4 hours. High levels of estradiol trigger LH secretion by gonadotropes, which is positive feedback. The LH surge is also stimulated by gonadotropes, which we're going to just call G and RH, and progesterone. During the LH surge, estradiol levels increase, but progesterone levels continue to increase. Estradiol levels decrease, but progesterone levels continue to increase. The LH surge stimulates enzymes that initiate the breakdown of the follicle wall and release of the now mature ovum within about 16 to 32 hours. So it's there, here's the follicle, it's in this, or here's the egg, it's in this follicle. The hormones that are releasing kind of wear out the thing that's housing it, and so that egg can burst through and be released, which is kind of cool if you think about it. And the LH surge also triggers completion of the first mitotic division of the oocyte within about 36 hours. So the egg it starts dividing and turning into a human if it's fertilized. All right, luteal phase, which is the final phase of our cycle. Hope you're still with me. luteal phase. This phase begins after ovulation. It lasts about 14 days unless fertilization occurs. Again, that's 14 days is an average. Some people have a 12-day, some people have a 16-day. On average, it's about 14. Mine is just now getting to 14. When I first had my miscarriage, it was about 11 days. But again, I worked with the acupuncturist to extend it. This is the time when, if the egg is fertilized, the lining is going to change to receive the egg, to receive the fertilized egg, and all the magic is happening. So you want to have it at least 12 days. I believe if it's anything less than 12 days, you have what's called a luteal phase defect. It's too short. And if you did have a fertilized egg and it tried to implant on day 9 and your lining starts shedding on day 10, it doesn't really have a chance. So you'll be able to figure that out once you start charting. In this phase, the ruptured follicle closes after releasing the egg and forms a structure called a corpus luteum, which I mentioned previously, which produces increasing quantities of progesterone. The progesterone produced by the corpus luteum prepares the uterus in case an embryo is implanted. So what is the progesterone doing to prepare the uterus? It causes the endometrium to thicken, filling with fluids and nutrients to nourish a potential embryo. Progesterone causes the mucus in the cervix to thicken so that its sperm or bacteria are less likely to enter the uterus. So it's making it like a safe, snuggly place for a potential baby. So it's creating that thick mucus lining over the cervix so nothing can get in. So no sperm, no germs, nothing else can get past there, or not get past. They make it more difficult to get past. It thickens it up, makes it a little more protective so that that fetus is just, or the embryo is just it's nice and safe and snuggly in there. Progesterone also causes body temperature to increase slightly during the luteal phase and remain elevated until a menstrual period begins. So that's going to be the spike that we'll see when we get into charting. That's how you can confirm that ovulation has happened. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell you like when it's happening, but it can confirm that it has happened. And this was instrumental for me while I was visiting or while I was going to my last RE, because there was one time where I did not ovulate and I could tell because I was charting. And so I went in and they did a blood test and confirmed it. He couldn't even see it on the ultrasound. He was saying, oh no, that's probably the corpus luteum. And I was like, but my temperature hasn't risen. And so this is important. That progesterone will give you a spike in temperature. It's warming you up. It's warming your uterus up so that it can be nice and snuggly for the baby. During most of the luteal phase, the estrogen level is high. Estrogen also stimulates the endometrium to thicken, and we want it to be like thicken. I think of it as like fluffy, because in the follicular phase, we're growing it because they go in and measure like if it's 6 millimeter, 7 millimeter. They ideally want it to be 8 millimeter when you're in an assisted reproductive technology cycle, and so it's building that lining. In this phase of it, it's getting like fuzzy and receptive, so like that little guy can root in there and snuggle in because it's all eventually going to be covered in the lining, right? So that's what is feeding the baby, helping it connect to mom especially during that first trimester until the placenta can take over. So the increase in estrogen and progesterone levels causes milk ducts in the breast to widen, dilate. So that's why we get like sore boobs, larger boobs during our luteal phase. As a result, the breast may swell and become tender. And if you become pregnant, they're going to continue to swell and stay tender throughout that pregnancy. So that's always like when we're doing symptom spotting and my breasts are tender, is it a sign? Is it not a sign? It's the progesterone in your body. And if you're taking progesterone supplements, watch out. It's like through the roof, those symptoms. If the egg is not fertilized, we hope it is, the corpus luteum degenerates after 14 days. Levels of estrogen and progesterone decrease, and as we learned in follicular phase, that's when the period, your menses, is going to start again, right? Because the body knows, hey, nothing happened. We did not get pregnant this month, so let's get rid of this lining and let's start all over again for next cycle and see if we can try it again. And that also happens, I want to say, if a fertilized egg does not implant, because that is a thing, right? Sometimes it gets fertilized and it just can't get in there, it can't latch on for whatever reason. Maybe the endometrium lining wasn't thick enough, maybe the timing was late. So the body recognizes that it didn't implant, but it may have tried to implant, and that's why sometimes we'll see an HCG that's like a 2 or 3 when you go in for your cycle day 2-3 testing. So yeah, but either way, if there's not a fertilized egg that implanted, then that signals to the body it didn't work this cycle. if the embryo is implanted, the cells around the developing embryo begin to produce a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG, which is what we measure when we take a pregnancy test. This hormone helps maintain the corpus luteum, which continues to produce progesterone. So if you have HCG in your system, it's signaling to that corpus luteum, hey, there's a pregnancy going on. I'm going to need you to hang out. Keep that progesterone coming. We need that lining to keep going. Yes, if implantation does occur, the corpus luteum does not degenerate but remains functional in early pregnancy, supported by HCG that is producing the developing embryo. This is the lifeline for the baby during that first trimester because the placenta is not fully formed yet. It's beginning to form. It's part of the cells that are dividing. It's getting ready to gear up to take care of the baby. It kind of kicks in. I want to say like 10 weeks, 11 weeks, but typically women will take supplemental progesterone until about 12 weeks. But 13 weeks for sure, the placenta is in full gear and taking care of that little one. There's another thing on endometrium, which I'll do a separate video about. We'll talk about the endometrium before we get into cycle charting. During the menstrual cycle, the endometrium cycles through its own phases, and there are 3 phases of that: menstrual, proliferative, and secretory. So I'll talk about that in another video. All right, guys, did that make sense? Hopefully you learned a little bit. You have now the basic foundation for your reproductive system and how your cycle works. I thought that was a good place to start Sunday Cycle Science, so we're all grounded in the same information, and then we can go forth and conquer. I hope you are well. If you have any questions or comments, please, as always, leave them below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Remember to share it with anyone who you think might find it useful, and I look forward to talking to you guys in the comments a little bit later. All right, guys, bye. Mwah. Baby dust to you all. Raindrops fall, and the beauty of it all is when the sun comes shining through to make the